All right, we had said 1 minute after the hour we start, so that's now. I'm very thrilled to welcome you to this exciting event on Unpacking the Power of Phytase. We have quite a packed agenda for the next hour. We're going to have 4 presentations from very distinguished speakers who have spent years, if not decades, of their life working on Phytase. And then a panel discussion with 4 experts as well. I'm Lucie Klarsfeld. I'm the managing director of Hystra, an inclusive business strategy consulting firm that has worked in nutrition for the past decade, looking at different business models that can help solve malnutrition issues in developing markets. And I'm very excited to be the moderator for the panel later today. Without further ado, I'll pass it straight on to Matthew Freeman, who is the executive director of Stronger Foundations for Nutrition, a global philanthropic community working together to end malnutrition, for opening remarks. And I just want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Sight and Life for organizing this webinar. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Lucie. Statistics can be overwhelming. Numbers blend together and lose their meaning. So I will only give you 3 to remember today. 3 billion, 1/3, 1. 3 billion, the number of people around the world that are micronutrient deficient in essential nutrients like iron and zinc, which promote good health. 1/3, the percentage of the food system contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. 1, malnutrition is projected to be the #1 cause of death due to climate change. These numbers are connected. Animal-sourced foods are the easiest way for the body to get essential nutrients. Animal production is also the greatest driver of food systems emissions. Cutting down on animal production in order to meet climate goals can drive micronutrient deficiencies up, particularly given that climate change is making all food more scarce and less nutritious. Clearly, scaling up plant-based diets must be an essential part of the climate solution. But how can we do that while also closing the nutrient gap? Much of the conversation on food systems focuses on scaling up sustainable production, preventing loss, and improving the nutritional profile of foods. Today, we look at a different angle, a concept which I find fascinating, called anti-nutrients. Anti-nutrients like phytic acid keep our body from absorbing the nutrients in plants which we desperately need. Anti-nutrient. It sounds like a supervillain in an action movie. Today, we're going to introduce you to a superhero, Phytase, that just might be able to help save us. I'm now pleased to introduce our first superhero sidekick, Priyanka Kumari, Manager for Food and Agribusiness at Sight and Life Foundation, to begin our super story. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. In next few minutes, I'll walk you through the challenges of phytic acid and explore phytase as a potential solution. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let's start with a basic question. What does the world eat? What we consume falls into 2 categories. First is staples, which mainly include grains and pulses, and second, others constituting animal products, fats, etc. Globally, 49% of daily calories come from staples. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is 80%, and in South and Southeast Asia, around 70%. Next slide. With business as usual, the share of staples is expected to rise, especially in low and middle income countries, with sub-Saharan Africa seeing the highest growth. This is driven by rising income, cultural shift, and growth of plant-based food market. Next slide. Now, the question which comes to mind is, apart from affordability and accessibility, what attracts consumers towards staples? The answer lies in perception. Consumers see staples as a food which is healthy, a source of energy, and full of nutrients. Next slide. However, many don't know that staples contain anti-nutrients which can hinder nutrient absorption. Thus, the consumers get less than expected from their diet. Today, our focus is on phytic acid. Next slide. Phytic acid acts like a magnet, binding to essential nutrients such as amino acids and minerals, forming insoluble compounds that the body can't absorb. This results in wasting of nutrients and reduced benefits from food. Phytic acid is particularly concerning because it remains effective in a wide pH range, including low intestinal pH, making it a significant challenge for human nutrition. Next slide. This situation worsens by climate change. Studies have proved that rising temperatures increase phytic acid and decrease nutrients in staples. This could lead to a mineral and protein loss of 3 to 17%. Next slide. Additionally, climate change, along with factors like supply chain disruptions and geopolitical conflicts, is driving food inflation. Over the past 3 years, inflation has made healthy diets unaffordable for over a third of the global population. Next slide. So, to summarize, rising plant-based diets combined with higher phytic acid levels, declining nutrient content, and escalating inflation can increase mineral and protein deficiencies, especially in low and middle income countries. This could lead to an additional 122 million people being protein deficient and 175 million suffering from zinc deficiency by 2050. Next slide. This calls for an urgent need of solutions to improve plant-based diet nutrition. One such solution is phytase. Next slide. Phytase is an enzyme that breaks down phytic acid, freeing amino acids and minerals, making them more available for absorption by the body. It acts on both added minerals and those naturally inherent in plant-based diets, making nutrients more available to improve nutrient intake. Next slide. Now, let's look at its benefit. Phytase is backed by over 20 human studies demonstrating 2 to 5 times increase in iron and zinc absorption, over 30 studies proving up to 99% phytic acid reduction, and up to 2-fold improvement in protein solubility due to phytase addition. Recent sensory studies have also revealed enhanced texture and aroma in plant proteins treated with phytase. In the next session, Professor Diego will provide further insights into these studies. In addition to the benefits, phytase is compatible with a wide range of packaged foods, particularly in emerging economies where cereal and legume-based foods are growing, offering significant market potential. Thus, phytase is a proven, cost-effective, climate-friendly solution with huge market. Next slide. Despite the benefits and market potential, phytase is in early stages of adoption for human nutrition. However, it is already a $600 million market in animal feed. So, to integrate phytase into food applications, we can learn from its advancement in feed industry. Lastly, I would like to end with a thought. To fully unlock phytase's potential for human use, we need collaborations to advance product development and conduct further studies, particularly on its impact on protein digestibility. Thank you very much for listening. Now I'll hand it over to Professor Diego for the session on scientific evidence.
Thank you very much, Priyanka, and also from my side, welcome everybody and have a good day. I'm going to talk as introduced by Priyanka about the human studies that investigated phytase and phytic acid and its effect on bioavailability and digestibility. Next slide, please. As Priyanka has brilliantly introduced, the reasons for iron and zinc deficiency worldwide are related to the low bioavailability mainly, and also to the low iron and zinc content sometimes of highly refined cereal-based diets. Phytic acid is highly negatively charged and can bind avidly throughout all the pH range that is physiological with iron, zinc, but also with proteins and carbohydrate, forming insoluble complexes that are very hard to absorb by humans and single-stomached animals. Next slide. Phytic acid is bound to phosphorus and is the main phosphor store of the plant. And as for stores in seeds and legumes, they are co-localized with minerals. So iron and zinc are often co-localized with phytic acid in the grains. And you see this in this micrograph where a wheat grain is represented, and you can see the content of phosphorus, so phytic acid, and in green, and the content of iron in red. And they're really co-localized. That means that by milling, it will be very hard to separate the minerals from the phytic acid. Also, it's important to realize that the phytic acid content of a whole wheat grain is around 1,000 milligrams per kilogram, whereas here we're talking about trace elements, which are present in milligrams amounts. So phytic acid is, in terms of concentration, is overwhelming the concentration of trace elements. Next slide. Bioavailability is a key determinant for iron and zinc requirements in nutrition. And here I copied tables from the WHO that highlight that we have a 3 to 4-fold higher requirement of iron and zinc when the low bioavailability from the diet is present. And you can see that in the upper table for iron going from 5.9 milligrams per day at 15% bioavailability to 17.8% at 5% bioavailability. Next slide. I would like to present you two simple studies that were being conducted looking at the direct addition of phytase to a test meal. This study was conducted using stable iron isotopes. This is considered the golden standard for bioavailability and absorption studies in humans. Phytase was from Aspergillus niger. It's active at low pH and also pH 5. The subjects were generally iron status repleted, so we don't expect a very, very high absorption because they are iron repleted. This is natural, but they were fed a maize meal which contained iron, and when this maize meal also contained phytase, which was added almost as a supplement in a micronutrient sachet called sprinkles, this strongly enhanced iron bioavailability in both iron compounds that were added to the maize meal, showing that phytase at the point of addition can be very effective. I want to show you a second study that is a randomized controls trial conducted in school children in South Africa. This is the golden standard methodology to assess efficacy over long term of a food or a micronutrient supplement, but also a pharmaceutical compound, for example. This is the methodology that is mostly accepted. And here, in this study, which lasted 23 weeks, in children which had a higher prevalence of iron and zinc deficiency, we can see that in the intervention, in the first bar in the graph, we have a stark decrease in the prevalence of zinc deficiency, and in the third bar, we have a very strong decrease in iron deficiency. Iron absorption over the trial was estimated to be around 7 to 8%, which is not bad, considering these children were later also repleted, so they naturally will have absorbed less. And there was also a marginal effect on anthropometry in the treatment groups in these children. Next slide. So phytase is a natural enzyme that is present in plants and can be made also in bacteria and fungi, and has been classified to not represent any hazard to health by the FAO WHO expert committee on food additives, which didn't define and allow daily intake. And they also defined some use cases, such as in dietary and food supplements, in beverages, in flour and breakfast cereals, but also in fortified blended foods. It's also an approved food additive by the Codex Alimentarius. Next slide. The evidence is quite overwhelming. We have a lot of studies showing what I've shown before. So an increase in iron and zinc bioavailability when phytic acid is reduced in foods, but also when we add phytase on iron and zinc, that this is the strongest evidence. We have some suggestive evidence also on calcium, that calcium might be have a slightly higher absorption when phytic acid is reduced, but calcium is dependent on other nutrients rather than only phytic acid. And there are really no human studies on protein digestibility, so that's maybe an open question and an urgent question to be solved. But there are suggestions from animal studies that phytic acid degradation could enhance protein digestibility as well. Next slide. So to conclude, phytase is a very effective and well-proven in enhancing iron and zinc absorption at point of consumption. It's also efficacious in decreasing iron deficiency and zinc deficiency. It has a detectable effect in marginally increasing calcium absorption, and there are suggestive effects for animal in vitro studies for increasing protein digestibility. Next slide. There's certainly a potential for these enzymes to be specifically adapted to food processing operations. And in food processing, phytate removal can also have techno-functional benefits, such as changing gelling, foaming, and texture properties. It certainly has a role to play in enhancing iron and zinc bioavailability for a healthier and safer iron supplementation and more sustainable diets. And with that, I would like to give the word to Mike Bedford from AB Vista for some application experiences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Diego. What I would like to show in my presentation is the application experiences in the animal feed industry. Has already been pointed out. We've been using phytases for more than 30 years now, and there's some interesting aspects to discuss. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? And I work with the industry in the animal feed industry, so clearly I have a competing interest here. If I can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the agenda is phytase action is relevant to animal response, and I want to just discuss dose-response relationships there, and then look at what I'm calling superdosing. So the evidence in animals now is pointing to really considering much higher doses than we've been using in the past. So we go to the next slide, sorry. This shows a typical phytase dose response curve with the units per kilogram of feed. Now, this could be pigs or chickens, so monogastric animals that we're feeding them to. And then on the y-axis is the available phosphorus matrix. Now, what does that mean? It means how much phosphorus are we releasing for the animal? What this is telling you is that the phosphates, there's 6 phosphates on phytic acid, are being released as we add more and more phytase, and as has been mentioned before, these phosphates are chelating minerals. And as we add more and more phytase, you can see the relationship is log linear. In other words, it's not a linear response, it's decaying. As you add more and more phytase, the incremental response is reduced. Now, why is that? Partly because as you add phytase, you're reducing the amount of substrate left, and there's a relationship between how much phytate is there and how fast the phytase works. But also it's got to do with the way phytate is broken down. So if I can see the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is on the top left, you can see the inositol ring with 6 phosphates, and the arrow points at where the phytase enzyme attacks the phosphate and releases it. So the first action is to attack IP6, take off the phosphate, which is green, and release it and produce IP5. IP5 on the right-hand side of that reaction is then attacked by the same phytase, and another phosphate is released to make IP4 and IP4 and so on, all the way down to IP1. Now, the important thing that we've recognized in animal nutrition now is that if you take a typical corn soy diet, which contains about 1% phytic acid or 0.24% phosphate, because there's inositol and phosphate in that molecule of phytic acid, You can see that bar graph on the right-hand side, that phosphorus release is related, not exactly the way it is there, where we're seeing that as you take IP5 to IP4, you're releasing 0.04% phosphorus and so on. Why is this of interest? Well, remember that was a curvilinear graph in the previous slide. IP6 is an easy substrate for phytase. IP5 is a very easy substrate for phytases, but then IP4, 3, 2 are much more difficult substrates for the phytase to break down, which means that the reaction rate slows. So we're very quick to get to IP4, and then we slow down dramatically as we try to get to IP1. And that last molecule, IP1, inositol monophosphate, that is broken down in the duodenum and jejunum by alkaline phosphatases. So that describes our understanding it. Why are we interested in the different IPs? If I can have the next slide, please. It's because people focus on IP6 or phytic acid, but actually phytases start producing those lower esters and they are not innocuous. So if this is a simple correlation analysis between the concentrations of IP3 and IP4 with digestibility of different nutrients. So the nutrient ileal AME or energy, you can see the more IP3 that's present, the poorer the energy digestibility in that diet, with the correlation coefficient of 0.84, which is quite high and highly very, very significant. But of interest to this discussion, ileal nitrogen digestibility or protein digestibility is negatively correlated with IP3 and sodium. And you can see that ileal IP4 is negatively related with magnesium and iron digestibility, which fits well with this discussion here. So when we talk about improving digestibility of nutrients, we've got to think about not just getting rid of IP6, but also getting rid of IP5, 4, 3, and possibly 2. We're not 100% sure yet. I want to show on the next slide, this is to show you just how high a dose of phytase we need to go to in order to remove phytic acid and its lower esters. So on the x-axis, just look at the negative control. Ignore the two right-hand side graphs. We can talk about them if it comes into the discussion. But what we've measured here is the concentration in the ileum of IP6 or phytic acid. In the negative control, you can see it's almost 60,000. And then the orange bar is the sum of IP6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. So the lower esters down to IP2. And you can see that the difference between the two is not very great. That's because most of the diet, you can see that the presence of the esters is IP6. There's very little 5, 4, 3, 2. As we add 500 units of phytase, you can see you degrade the total amount of IP6 to about 50%, but we've increased the contribution of the lower esters. And as we add more and more phytase, you can see at 13,500 units, we've pretty much reduced it to 0, and certainly almost to 0 with 40,500. Now, the point I'd make, 500 units is where the industry standard is and was. We're moving to much higher levels now to get the benefits which we're now seeing when we go to much higher levels. That is because the lower esters still have a negative influence on, particularly on protein digestibility. And the other element I'm going to talk very briefly on is inositol, which is the gray bars here. And you can see significantly increased levels of inositol are present, ready for absorption as you go to, at the moment, what we would call ridiculously high doses of phytase. So phytase dose is not optimized, even in the animal industry. We could feed more if it was just cheaper or more effective. Next slide, please. This is very brief. This is amino acid digestibility. On the x-axis, you can see the numbers going from 0.9 to 1.2. What this is the digestibility of amino acids when we fed different levels of phytase. The 1 represents the digestibility of the diet with no phytase added. But you can see if you take, for example, methionine, which is the amino acid at the bottom of that graph, as we added the blue bar at 500 units, we've got about a 1% improvement in methionine digestibility. As you go to higher and higher levels, you can see that amino acid digestibility increases proportionately. And often in animal studies, we're using low levels of phytase, and there is this feeling that amino acid digestibility effects are equivocal. but it's probably because we're not using enough to get significant changes that we can detect significantly. Okay, next slide, please. Very briefly, inositol is released if we get to really high levels of phytase. This is really interesting from our viewpoint in the animal feed industry because it's an insulin mimetic, so it actually aids in insulin activity. And it's also a precursor for second messengers, IP3, IP4, IP5, which is from a metabolism viewpoint very interesting. And IP5 is actually involved in oxygen transfer from hemoglobin. So very interesting in terms of reducing oxygenation problems. Okay, next slide, please. I think I'm on that. So summary, phytase is never fully degraded to inositol. The lower esters are not innocuous. Values accrue from higher doses of phytase from mineral energy and amino acid release, but also production of inositol. And the response is log linear, so the optimum conversion from IP6 through the lower esters to inositol is never actually achieved. Next slide, please. Thank you. And with that, I'll introduce on the next slide, Maaike Bruins from DSM, who's going to talk about phytase in food supplements.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to make a statement of conflict of interest. In the next slide. Yes, I'm employed by dsm-firmenich, which is a supplier of food solutions, including enzymes to the food industry. So it's an obvious conflict of interest. And then today, I would like to introduce to you the topic of phytase, and also, as you can see in the next slide, that how it works, the mode of actions, but also the potential use of the enzyme in different formats. And I will give you a very short regulatory overview. To start with, how can the enzyme work? There's actually two basic ways it can act. The enzyme can already act in the food by degrading the phytic acid, or it can act in the ingredients that go into the food or into the recipe, and then it's called a processing aid. The other way the enzyme can act is in the GI tract, so in the stomach, but also in the small intestine. Then it's called an ingredient, a functional ingredient or an active ingredient. And those two you have to keep in mind, because for regulatory, this makes a difference. I also would like to repeat what Priyanka already said. The enzyme can act both on the minerals that are intrinsically present in the cereals or the legumes, or it helps to make the minerals that are added to the food more bioavailable. So it has a dual mode of action. Then in the next slide, I show you a few examples of how the enzyme can be applied. First of all, you could think of using it in voluntary fortified foods, or even plant-based foods that are not fortified to make minerals more available. And you could think, for instance, of plant-based meat alternative, plant-based dairy, or bread, the flatbreads like tortillas. You also have porridges, for instance, where you could use it, and condiments. In certain foods, it probably will not act as a processing aid, for instance, condiments, but then it would act rather in the GI tract. Second of all, and that has probably the largest reach, is if you could use the enzyme in large-scale fortified foods to improve the mineral status. And you could think, for instance, of flours, oils, or bouillon cubes. And in certain cases, it cannot act as a processing aid already in the food, but then you could consider more a heat-stable enzyme that acts in the stomach. So both options are possible. The easiest option probably is that you include the enzyme to get into nutritional powders, micronutrient powders, or lipid-based paste type of foods that you add to a meal which is high in phytic acid. And another option is including it into cereals that are used for porridges, for instance, for young children And a last of all, I don't see it on the market yet a lot, you could think of using the enzyme as a supplement for those who are consuming a high plant-based diet, so vegetarians or vegans. So in the next slide, I will give you a very short overview of the two ways you can use the enzyme. And the first is, as I already mentioned, the use as a processing aid or additive. That means that you need to inactivate it in the food at the end of the process. And it needs to be inactive, so denatured, and it can be inactivated, for instance, through a heating step in the process, so baking of the bread or anything alike. That also means because it's no longer there, you don't need to declare it on the label. But that also means you cannot make a claim on the enzyme because you don't have it in your product anymore. But you could probably consider, because you made the minerals more available, you could consider making a claim on the more bioavailable minerals. Then the use as a functional ingredient, that's registration-wise slightly more work, but it can be it can have a high potential because it acts in the GI tract. It allows you to add it to more foods, but it needs to be declared on the label as an ingredient. But it also allows to make a claim on the enzyme and its benefits, probably in certain countries, based on the science that is behind. And Diego already elaborated on that. So then last of all, I would like to give you a very top line overview of the countries where the enzyme is cleared for the use as a processing aid in green, and also where the enzyme is registered for the use as a processing aid and for the use in supplements. So the use to act in the stomach and the GI tract. I would like to make a small note on countries like a few countries in Africa where the codex is used. There you have also sometimes the possibility to use it as a processing aid because codex refers to the enzyme for the use in food, but also for foods intended for older infants and young children. And that so far is my presentation, and I would like then to hand it over.
Thanks a lot, Maaike, and thanks to all the panelists. We will now move to the section of the panel discussion, and we'll try to focus on what this can mean for solving malnutrition issues, especially in low and middle income markets. So Diego, you presented the scientific studies of Phytase use in humans and explained a bit how the emerging research is showing the potential of innovation via Phytase. How significant of a role do you expect Phytase to play in addressing nutritional deficiencies, specifically in low and middle income markets?
Thank you, Lucie, for the question. I think it already plays a certain role in nutritional supplements and food delivered by the World Food Program in emergencies, where it is partly added to certain specialized foods. It certainly hasn't reached, as Priyanka has highlighted, hasn't reached its potential. It's not used widely yet. I think the concept of bioavailability itself, so the ability to absorb nutrients when they are present, is also not very present yet. I think regulatory bodies are knowledgeable about this. I think it's there in the codex and in many legislative laws. Bioavailability is present, so there is a certain awareness of this. But I think the concept of phytic acid and phytase is not very present yet, unfortunately. So I think webinars like this are important to raise the awareness of this issue and the importance to counteract anti-nutrients with phytase, but also with other means. I think there were questions on the chat. And the advantage of phytase is that it is effective for many nutrients, for iron, zinc, and potentially also proteins and calcium. Whereas if you add ascorbic acid or vitamin C, this is very effective for iron, but probably doesn't have much effect on zinc absorption, for example.
Thank you for this. And by the way, if any of you wants to answer the question in the chat, because we'll definitely have only limited time at the end, feel free to answer in writing. So Dr. Maaike, going back to you, you shared some experience with phytase use in micronutrient powders, in LNS, some plant-based alternatives. Where do you see, like which one do you see as potential good applications for phytase, and why specifically in these low and middle income markets?
Yeah, actually, I see potential for all of them, but probably I think the easiest to implement are the sachets and the powder that you add to food. That's really low hanging fruit. I think as a processing aid, that requires a bit more work on the manufacturing side to understand the process, but I think it's also having a high potential if you include it in staple foods that are consumed by a large part of the population, like bread type of foods, flours, condiments. Yes.
Well, thank you. So yeah, lots of opportunities, and as you showed on the map, only few that are fully taken advantage of at this stage. So let's talk a bit about the role of regulation in this. Pankaj, thanks for joining us. You're an industry expert in B2B nutrition at Sight and Life, with more than 20 years experience in topics around business development, innovation and strategic planning around nutrition. So specifically, you have some experience with the recent changes in the regulations in India. The Food and Safety Standards of India approved the use of phytase in food products and nutraceuticals for phytate reduction in October 2022. It had been used before that in animal feed for decades, so how did the FSSI basically manage to get it approved for human use? What was the process?
For your question, Lucie, FSSAI stands for the Indian Food Regulatory Authority, Food Safety Standard Authority of India. The presence of phytate, which is phytic acid, in food is a significant nutritional issue. Adding phytase, which is an enzyme in the food that enhances the release of essential micronutrients, especially the iron, calcium, zinc, and magnesium. And that helps in terms of the absorption of these nutrients overall. From a nutritional perspective, phytase by global regulatory authorities as well has been declared as a GRAS status, generally regarded as a safe. And studies in different parts of the world have shown, especially in the animal nutrition, there is a growing acceptance. However, for human consumption also, there have been several studies that are being carried out. And as far as the safety is concerned, there is no significant safety concerns that have been notified when used within approved limits. So that's the take that the authority has considered, and based on that, FSSAI has approved it as a processing aid in October 22.
Thank you. Did any of the work done in the animal feed part help as well?
Yeah, so FSSAI predominantly monitors only the food and beverage industry. So as far as the reference are considered, it's mainly the codex and several human studies that are being carried out. As I mentioned about the GRAS status for this phytase, the risk has already been considered. And for the dosage guidelines, in fact, FSSAI recommends it as GMP, good manufacturing practices. So from a food company perspective, as Maaike mentioned, there is small amount of R&D that needs to be carried out individually by a food producer for a specific format of food when they would like to enrich it with the phytase enzyme.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving on to maybe the more kind of commercial and marketing angle for this. Amy, you're our last speaker. You're the CEO and founder of Good Fight. And before that, you've spent close to 20 years working on nutrition and preventative health, including doing a lot of research on phytase and its ability to neutralize the anti-nutrient phytate. Can you please explain a bit what you've seen in terms of marketing phytase products, phytase supplements in your case? What are the kind of arguments that resonate well with your, I mean, I don't know if I should call them patients or clients. Yeah, what have you seen work in terms of the effect and in terms of the marketing messages that you convey?
Thank you, Lucie. Yeah, so we have been in the market since 2019 as a supplement. My research began in HIV and malaria because IP6 is required for HIV assembly. So that was where my research started in 2008 with the Canadian Trials Network. And in malaria, where giving iron is at times contraindicated because it increases your susceptibility to malaria, phytase is an alternative that can be used in those situations. So we came to market in 2019. It has been a heavy lift to educate consumers about micronutrients, about what phytase is. And ultimately, what's happened is that because of the results that people have seen, it's really spread quite easily through word of mouth. We have done marketing. We're a startup organization, but we've had pretty incredible results in a number of chronic conditions, and obviously in iron deficiency and immunity.
Thank you. And are there, in terms of how you propose your product, are there specific messages that you provide, specific aspects that have been helpful to maybe bring in the first patients? Do you know from which communities these first patients came?
Yeah, so in terms of the autoimmune conditions, that again, that sort of spread organically through people that were seeing results in those conditions. Multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease, very significant results there. But essentially, the way that we try to explain it is just that phytate binds to all of the micronutrients and makes them unavailable for the body to absorb, and that phytase then breaks that down so that the body is able to absorb it. The research dating back to Dr. Harland and Dr. Oberle's years ago shows that phytate also complexes the endogenous pool of zinc in the body. And so, like Mike was saying, it's important to see and to use higher doses of phytase to be able to liberate that zinc.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A asked around the market size of currently of phytase for human consumption in Africa, as well as the relative cost compared to adding more iron or adding more zinc into foods. I don't know if Maaike, this is a question you would like to take, putting you a bit on the spot here.
Yeah, the market size I find difficult to answer. I don't know, maybe Priyanka. The cost I can comment of adding the enzyme versus what you would need to add if you would fortify. It depends really. It's case by case, but what we have done some modeling and calculations. But it's true, you add a little bit of cost by adding the enzyme, but you add only a few microgram. But because you add this enzyme, you also need to add less of your fortificant. So in the end, you can reduce the amount of iron, zinc, calcium, etc. that you fortify your food with. And that also has some benefits because we know that adding a lot of iron, especially the one that is not absorbed, may have adverse effects on your microbiome. So it can be definitely cost effective.
Thank you. Priyanka or Pankaj from the Site and Life side. I think Priyanka mentioned earlier that the current market was about 600 million for phytase in animal feed, but do you have any data points on the human consumption side?
Lucie, so in human nutrition, phytase consumption is at very nascent stage of. There are only few selected products, that too in high-income countries. Yeah, but there is potential of phytase addition in more than 45 product formats.
Thank you. There's been quite a few questions also on the additional, and Amy, you actually started alluding to that, on the additional benefits that phytase can have. Some people are asking, for example, about some anti-cancer properties. There were some questions also, on other benefits beyond just improving the kind of micronutrient status. Any observations, maybe from others than Amy on this panel, on the additional benefits that that phytase can have?
Yeah, I'm just sorry, Lucie. I was just typing an answer to that. In animals, what we're finding is very high levels of phytase. So I understand the question is basically phytic acid is implicated to have anti-cancer effects. But what we found with animals is you feed very, very high levels of phytase. What you do is you break it down to inositol in the gut. The inositol is absorbed, and then it's rephosphorylated proportionately to the serum levels of inositol that you've delivered. So as long as there's enough inositol and phosphate, the animal actually rebuilds back. In chickens, IP5, which is very important for oxygen transfer. So ironically, the higher level of phytase, the higher the levels of IPs in the body. That's one of the findings from Sami Dridi's lab in Arkansas, and a few groups also now working in Europe.
Right. Any additional points from anyone on the panel on the benefits of phytase? If not, maybe going back to you, Maaike, on the other advantages now, looking at the planet as well. How do you see phytase contributing potentially to climate resilient food systems in low and middle income markets?
Yeah, that is I think a good question, because I think with the growing population and what we also see with the climate change is that we need to shift more towards sustainable and also very nutrient dense foods, and especially plant-based foods. So if we can unlock the micronutrients, especially the minerals in those crops, I think that brings great potential, especially because we see now more reliance on those on phytic-rich crops. And on top, you also see that the climate has an impact on mineral and protein content. And you see a trend of lowering of iron and zinc and also protein in crops. So if we can use the enzyme as part of a bigger solution to make the minerals more bioavailable, I think it's a way to move and shift more towards plant.
Thank you. Very clear. Is there, and maybe going back then to you, Diego, you mentioned a bit that, phytase was just beginning to be known. Do you see any strategies to bring the awareness gap, so not at the consumer side that Amy alluded to, but on the policymaker side? What is required to bridge the awareness gap, given all these advantages?
I think on the regulatory side, highlighting the health benefits is certainly paramount. That is the most important argument. I think other arguments have been alluded also in the chat a little bit. I mean, can we not ferment foods and use the potential of fermentation? That is certainly possible. It is by definition, though, fermentation or some of the traditional fermentation approaches are not really standardized, and that's where this maybe could also be used as an argument. with regulatory bodies, that we are actually making the traditional more resilient, and we renew the tradition in a way that makes it more accessible and easier to use, by adding the actually important ingredient of the fermentation that reduces phytic acid. So bridging the gap is also rediscovering traditions. Maybe this is more of a political rediscovering traditions with a modern touch, and this could be attractive, maybe argument for consumers, but also for regulatory bodies.
Thank you. Pankaj, is that an argument that has been used in India, or that that the government has been maybe particularly sensitive to, the reviving tradition argument?
So from a processing perspective, as Diego rightly said, fermentation or the conventional processing techniques has always been on the forefront in terms of promoting the best practices, best cooking practices. However, as we see the emerging trend as far as the convenience foods are concerned, especially the plant-based diets, now there is a need because what we see here is the presence of phytic acid, which is a major anti-nutrient. The only solution so far available is the enzyme phytase. There have been other ingredients like prebiotics, or like as the Diego said about vitamin C, but that can only help in terms of a single mineral absorption, not the complete absorption of calcium, magnesium, zinc, and iron. So that way, FSSAI has concern about the fortification in general. FSSAI promotes very heavily in India the large-scale food fortification programs. In fact, India has been in forefront in terms of getting the guidelines ready for all these staples, including wheat or rice, milk, oil, and salt. So that way, FSSAI is considering one of the Prime Minister objective here is the anemia Mukt Bharat, anemia free India. So iron deficiency anemia is on the top of the government agenda. Looking at that, all the consolidated efforts are striving towards making fortification more accessible and affordable, and fight itself in terms of meeting the agenda what government has.
Okay, so beyond the progresses on the regulation side, is the government and the FSSAI specifically doing anything to promote these innovations and ensure further bioavailability of the micronutrients in food?
Yes, so as far as the fortification is concerned, there have been very clear guidelines in India what salt form of iron or calcium or magnesium to be used in all these staples. So it has been very well stated, and there is a scientific panel who does review of all these, and they only recommend the levels of fortification along with the form of the nutrient that is to be used. However, as we see iron, especially the absorption has very significant concern, especially in the fortified staples like the fortified rice, where the iron is dosed as ferric pyrophosphate, which is the insoluble form of iron. And because of its insolubility, it is not absorbed, and hence there are different techniques like micronization or encapsulation that is being practiced. However, Phytase that way comes out to be a very simple solution, and that is the uniqueness that perhaps can be promoted or discussed or advocated amongst the food industry.
Thank you, Pankaj. Diego, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just to highlight the opportunity to use phytase in the food industry. There are certain production processes that would be quite suitable, I think, to the use of phytase, integrating phytases. Obviously, not every single production process, but wet processes or the production of plant-based protein concentrates that are mostly a wet process could be really considered. And we saw that these products are actually very rich in phytic acid, because the process doesn't really reduce it automatically.
Thank you. Amy, before going to you, just one more question on the technical side, because there have been quite a few questions in the chat on the technicalities of using phytase that you started answering, Diego. But there were a few questions on how stable it is when used in food fortification. So I don't know who wants to take that one, and then Amy, over to you.
Well,
Maaike?
currently, maybe Maaike.
Both you start first. I add to it.
The phytase currently, they will not survive pasteurization or high temperature short time treatment. So they're heat labeled, so it's an enzyme. There is obviously research in this area to create a heat stable or heat stabler phytase formulations. And maybe Maaike knows more about this.
Yeah, Maaike and then Amy, and then we'll close the panel.
Yeah, correct. And you have to make sure it acts at the optimum temperature. So yeah, the knowledge around the optimal performance with the humidity and the moisture and the water content and the temperature is very important to understand how it can act optimally.
Thanks, Maaike. Amy, over to you.
I just wanted to emphasize the response that we've heard from customers and how quickly this enzyme works. So we often hear from customers that within the first few days of taking the enzyme, their energy goes up significantly. And then in some of those chronic conditions, the response is typically within a week or two. So this is a very, very powerful enzyme. And we've had a lot of customer feedback and testimonials. So we are doing research, retrospective and prospective studies. And if anyone is interested in collaborating on that research, I'd be very open to discussing that. But the response has been pretty incredible. So I just wanted to highlight that.
And maybe a question then, because you're like the kind of supplement representative on the panel. How do you deal with the stability issue? Is that an issue for supplements as well, or not so much?
It is. So we have to be very careful, and we've put a lot of research and development into our product. So we have the product that's available in capsule form, which rather than adding it into food where heat becomes an issue, people can just take it in a capsule form.
Thank you very much. The panel was fascinating with the questions in the chat. I think we could have gone on for 4 hours, but we do have to close. I'll pass it on back to Matt for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Lucie, and to all of our speakers for a very rich set of presentations. There was so much great information shared, and I'll do my very best to summarize briefly. Phytate is a supervillain stealing our nutrients, and phytase can fight back. Phytase has already been used for over 30 years in the animal feed industry, and we now have more than 20 human studies completed, showing that it is both impactful and that there are no significant safety concerns. This is a critical innovation because nearly 50% of all global calories are coming from staples, which are high in phytate, and rising temperatures are only increasing phytic acid further. Consumers see these staples as healthy and full of nutrients when in fact the anti-nutrients are getting in the way. Phytase can mitigate this, for example, increasing iron and zinc absorption by 2 to 5 times. And phytase can degrade phytic acid within the food itself as a processing aid, as well as in the stomach and small intestine as a functional ingredient. Phytase has been approved as a food additive by the Codex Alimentarius, and it is cleared as a processing aid in several markets. It's compatible with a wide range of fortified staples, packaged foods and condiments, and specialized nutrition products, and can be added with relatively small amounts of R&D needed, although innovation is still required on heat stability. Because it reduces the amount of fortificant needed in food, it can be quite cost effective, and it also reduces the negative effect of overfortification on things like the health of the microbiome. Higher doses of phytase are even more effective, and if costs can be brought down, we can have even greater effects. We need to create awareness, generate demand, and further innovate on cost-effective applications so that the solutions are scalable. And all of this, of course, requires more investment. So please join us. You too can be a superhero in the fight against anti-nutrients for healthy people on a healthy planet. Thank you so much again to everyone for joining us today.